Hey there, Legal Tea listeners. This is your host, Jenny Roselle. We're back to Estate Planning of the Rich and Famous, where we chat about celebrities and their estate planning, or lack thereof. Today's episode is on the baseball great, Yogi Berra. If you're a baseball fan, and even just a little bit of one, you know who Yogi is. I'm not the biggest baseball fan in the world, and I know who he is. But if you do not know who old Yogi Berra is, he's arguably one of the biggest, most famous names in baseball. He lived a long, long life, passing away at the age of 90. So, as we always do on these celebrity estate planning episodes, let's talk a little bit about the person first, talk about Yogi first, then shift into what happened estate-wise following his death in 2015. So let's dive in. According to his Wikipedia page, Yogi was born in 1925 and hailed from St. Louis, and more specifically, an Italian community in St. Louis called The Hill. If you happen to know that area well, I figured I would mention that. Now, you may not know this, but it also may not surprise you. Yogi was not his real name. His legal name was not Yogi. His real name was Lorenzo Berra. How he got Yogi, I almost said yoga. How he got Yogi was when he was playing in a local baseball league back home. His friend, Jack McGuire, another Major League Baseball player, said that he looked like a yogi, which is someone who does yoga, when he sat around with his arms crossed, waiting to bat, or while looking sad after losing a game. So Yogi just stuck after that. In 1942, Yogi signed with the New York Yankees, though the following year in 1943, he joined the Navy for the Second World War. After being discharged in 1946, Yogi played in the minor leagues with the Newark Bears, which was an affiliate at the time for the Yankees. Still according to his Wikipedia page, on September 22nd, 1946, Yogi played his first game with the New York Yankees. And from there, the years after, his career skyrocketed, setting records, playing in the World Series multiple times, 14 to be exact, with 10 of the 14 being won. He was an all-star and played in many all-star games, won many, MVP awards, etc. The list could go on. He was not only a fantastic catcher and in later years an outfielder, but also an equally fantastic hitter. Yogi was a heck of a baseball player, I tell you. After he ended up retiring as a player, which happened in 1963, by the way, he spent some time as a manager and coach of the Yankees, of course, but also sometimes with the New York Mets and Houston Astros teams as well. Now, shifting to more personal stuff, Yogi married Carmen Short in 1949, and together they had 3 children, and all 3 were sons. Dale, who played professional baseball for the Pittsburgh Pirates and Yankees, of course, as well as the Houston Astros. Tim, who played professional football for the Baltimore Colts, which is funny to say since I am from Indiana, as in Indianapolis Colts. And if you know, you know. And Larry, who played baseball in the minor leagues. Fast forward time, many years, decades, Carmen started having some health complications, including a stroke, and ended up dying in March of 2014 at the age of 85. They had very recently celebrated their 65th wedding anniversary before her death. And it was not long after Carmen died, about a year and a half or so, when news broke that Yogi died in September of 2015 at the age of 90, and he died in his sleep of natural causes. So shifting to what happened estate-wise following his death, well, this seems to be a theme recently on these celebrity estate planning episodes. And as I've talked about before on these celebrity estate planning episodes, there wasn't a lot out there, and that's usually a good thing. When estate planning is done poorly or not done at all, that's usually when things start getting plastered on headlines about so and so's estate. Though I did a lot, and I mean a lot of digging, looking for anything on Yogi's estate or estate plan, documents, anything. I didn't find a ton. So, like I said, that tells me he probably had a really good estate plan. But I did find a few things that we could talk about on here, which I think are interesting. So, that's what the rest of this episode's going to entail. According to New York Times, about 25 years ago, Yogi's sons, Dale, Tim, and Larry, formed a company called LTD Enterprises for the purpose of managing their dad's, Yogi's, autographing and sponsorship opportunities. Now, Dale, the oldest, when explaining kind of why they created this company, he said, quote, "We created the company to protect him. Dad was naive and humble, and he was taken advantage of by agents and people in his life, like signing baseballs for $15 each when guys like Mantle and Mays got $100, end quote. Now, eventually, LTD Enterprises partnered with Steiner Sports Marketing to help promote and maintain Yogi's brand. As Tim, the middle son, explained, their main goal was to keep their dad's name around. In 2016, the year after Yogi died, Yogi's estate, LTD Enterprises, and Steiner Sports Marketing hit this kind of proverbial fork in the road where they had to gauge the likelihood of success of continuing Yogi's kind of brand or his name and likeness following his death. In fact, as the New York Times article asks kind of the reader to consider, they say, how potent will Yogi's name continue to be? Well, Tim answered that question and said, that's a good question. We're trying to see what's still there, but he has some advantages. He's a great Yankee. He's well known outside the athletic genre, and he's beloved by everybody, end quote. Well, this New York Times article was releasing, the purpose of the article was about releasing an update on the relationship between LTD Enterprises and Steiner Sports Marketing, and that the estate, LTD Enterprises, and Steiner basically had reached an agreement that gives Steiner the sole authority, or as the article states, quote, the exclusive rights to market Yogi's name and likeness and the rights to sell remaining pieces of his collection of memorabilia, including his 1953 World Series championship ring and several of his player contracts, end quote. Now, the article did confirm that nothing in the Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center, which is located in New Jersey, would be sold. But rather, the goal was to, quote, focus on the licensing of Yogi's name to products like apparel, food, posters, and trading cards, end quote. You know, if you're a faithful Legal Tea listener, I did a Legal Tea episode a handful of episodes ago that, if you remember, I talked about a publicist, an agent. Well, I guess it was technically a company, CMG Worldwide, that you may remember they exclusively represent deceased celebrities. Well, I mentioned that in this episode because in this New York Times article that I've been talking about, they brought up CMG Worldwide, and it talked about how that there's something called the Davy Brown Index, which measures a celebrity's influence on consumers. Well, can you believe there's actually a thing for that? I guess I'm not surprised, but yeah, it's called Davy Brown Index, and that's what it's used for. And it was used for Yogi and his estate and for kind of his brand and name and likeness. So interesting, right? Now, shifting to another story about Yogi. Like I said earlier, I searched and searched and searched for anything about Yogi's estate plan and really couldn't find anything. But I found article after article talking about how some of Yogi's like famous quips would be excellent tips and tricks and advice for financial planning. Well, in fact, One article, or maybe a blog, it's a blog is probably a better word to use, was from a law firm called Guideway Legal Document and Mediation, and they're based out of California. Well, they started the blog off with this statement: Yogi Berra made an extraordinary contribution to baseball, but he also provided savvy advice that applies to estate planning and life planning, end quote. I bring that up because that's a really, this next story is a really good example that I could, that would be good to share about Yogi's legal and financial decision making. And granted, I'm kind of cheating because this happened while Yogi was living, but it's just such a good story about kind of the legal and financial savviness that Yogi had. So, in an article from a local news source in New Jersey called NJ, which all these are source links on the Legal Tea website for this episode, it shared a story about how in the 1950s, Yogi and like 20 other of his teammates were hounded by a real estate guru who offered to sell them land in Central Florida for cheap, 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 like $30 an acre. Every single one of them, including Yogi, bought several plots of land. Well, fast forward some time, and it was relayed to them that this land was too swampy and would be unable to be built on. So, around that time in 1964, someone named M.T. Lott offered all of them $150 an acre for those silly, useless plots of land. Every single one of them sold, except for Yogi. The next year in 1964, it's 1965, I guess, it was released that the mysterious fellow named M.T. Lott was actually Walt Disney. And as the NJ article states, Walt Disney was, quote, quietly snapping up land for his next project, Disney World, to be built in Central Florida, end quote. It was eventually released that Walt Disney obtained 27,000 acres of those supposed swampy plots of land for next to nothing. But to complete his plans, as this article states, stubborn holdout owners like Yogi had to be wooed, end quote. So remember, his teammates sold their plots for $150 an acre. Well, Yogi eventually settled on a price of $300,000 an acre. So talk about a heck of a financial lesson and deal. I thought that story was a cool one to share about Yogi. And financial planning really goes hand in hand with my world of estate planning. So I thought it kind of fit for this celebrity estate planning episode. After all, estate planning quite literally deals with someone's assets. As we wrap up this episode, I think it's so important to reemphasize that this episode was filled with a couple of these kind of fun, specific stories relating to Yogi. But what the stories did not consist of was some dramatic, juicy estate saga that was all over the news or headlines. It's very likely because Yogi had a very good estate plan. And even if he had just, say like a last will and testament, I could have probably gotten my hands on that and told you who got what. But since there appears to be nothing out there, I'm guessing he had some solid estate planning in place that allowed his family to receive their parts of Yogi's estate free of any probate court process and free of any kind of public record process. So good for Yogi. He's not only good at baseball, but also appears to be good at estate planning. I love it. Alrighty, let's wrap this episode up and shift to a sneak peek at next week. Next week, we're back to a cautionary tale episode where we talk about real life clients, real life cases that I or my office have worked on, or maybe they're just generally good things to know or be aware of so that you do not turn into a cautionary tale episode one day. Next week, we are going to talk about something that I think many do not really understand. We are going to talk about when it is appropriate or when it's not for someone to sign estate planning documents. I hear people say things like, oh, that person has dementia, they can't sign anymore. And in my world, it's not that black and white. It's not a bright line rule like that. So tune in for that next week, Legal Tea listeners. And until then, take care and be well.